and my four-way flashers. You don't have to mention the mirror lights, but I'm gonna make sure they're properly mounted, secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, amber in color. Then I'm gonna check my headlights, make sure my headlights are clear or white in color, make sure they're not hazed or fogged over, make sure they're not cracked, bent, or broken, make sure they're properly mounted, secured, and working properly. I also make sure that my clearance lights and my marker lights is working properly. Next thing I'm gonna check is the lean on my truck. If it's leaning to the left or the right, it means it's either low tire pressure or suspension problem. And I'm gonna check underneath my truck, make sure there's no low hanging wires, hoses, or lines. Make sure there's no puddle underneath my truck. Then I'm gonna open my hood. I'm gonna go to the right side of my truck. I'm gonna do a general overview of all the lines, hoses. Make sure that there's no abrasion, bulgings, cut. Make sure there's nothing leaking. Make sure there's not any exposed wires. Then I'm gonna check my coolant reservoir. Make sure it's properly mounted, secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, and filled to manufacturer's specification. Make sure my cap's on tight. Once again, I'm gonna check my hose and make sure there's no abrasion, bulges, and cut. It goes down to my water pump. I'm gonna check my water pump, make sure it's properly mounted, secured, no missing or loose bolts. Make sure it's working properly, make sure it's not leaking. I'll also make sure that my coolant reservoir is not leaking. And that covers the side of the truck. That's it on this side of the truck, right, Willis?
Belt driven.
All right, it's belt driven. I'm gonna go to the left side of my truck. I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna get a general overview, of all my lines, hoses, and wires. Make sure there's no abrasion, bulges, and cuts. Make sure there's no leaks. Make sure there's no exposed wires. Then I'm gonna check my power steering reservoir, make sure it's properly mounted, secured, not cracked, bent, or broken. It's not leaking. I'm gonna check my power steering hose, which goes back here to my power steering pump. Make sure my power steering pump is properly mounted, secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking, and it's gear driven. Then I'm gonna check my alternator. Make sure my alternator is properly mounted, secured, not cracked, bent, or broken. I'm not missing any bolts or doesn't have any loose bolts. And it doesn't have any exposed wire going to it. Then I'm gonna check my belt to make sure there's no more than 3/4 inches of play when I press it in the middle. Make sure it's not cut, torn, or frayed. Then I'm gonna check my air conditioner. Then I'm gonna check my air compressor, make sure it's properly mounted, secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not leaking, and working properly. Then I'm gonna check my engine oil fill, make sure it's properly mounted, secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, and not leaking. Then I'm gonna check my engine oil and my engine oil dipstick. The way I check my engine oil, I pull the dipstick out, I wipe it clean, put it back in, pull it back out, and make sure it's between add and full. Let's see. Then I'm gonna check my frame, make sure it's not cracked, bent, or broken, and no illegal welds. Then I'll check my steering rod, make sure my steering rod is not cracked, bent, or broken, properly mounted, secured, doesn't have any illegal welds. Make sure it's greased properly. Make sure that the U-joints on it's greased properly. Then I'm gonna check my gearbox, my pitman arm, my drag link, my control arm, my tie rod ends. Make sure they're properly mounted, secured with a castle nut with a Carter pin. Then I'm gonna check my front and rear spring hangers. Make sure they're properly mounted, secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, and properly mounted, secured to the frame. Then I'm gonna check my leaf springs, make sure they're properly mounted, secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, no illegal welds, and not misaligned. Then I'm gonna check my U-bolts, make sure they're properly mounted, secured to my front axle, the nuts are on tight. Then I'm gonna check my shock absorber, make sure it's properly mounted, secured, not cracked, bent, or broken. It's secured with a bolt at the bottom and a bolt at the top, and the seals are intact. Then I'm gonna check my brake hose airline, make sure it's properly mounted, secured. There's no abrasion, bulges, and cut, and it's not leaking. Make sure it's properly mounted, secured to my brake chamber. That is secured with a band clamp. It is on tight. It's properly mounted, secured, not cracked, bent, or broken. It's not leaking. Then I'm gonna check my slack adjuster and my push rod. Make sure they're connected with a connecting pin. If I want to check my front brakes, I chock my wheels, release on my tractor brakes, and if I can pull the slack adjuster out more than an inch, then the brakes need to be adjusted before I go on the trip. Next thing I'm going to check is my brake lining, and you can call that brake shoes. Make sure they're properly mounted, secured, and that crack, bent, or broken doesn't have any oil, grease, or any debris on it. Then I'm going to check my brake drum, make sure it's properly mounted, secured, and that crack, bent, or broken, and has no illegal welds. Then I'm going to check my inner and outer tire face and make sure there's no abrasions, bulges, and cuts. Then I'm going to check my tire face itself, make sure it's worn evenly, make sure I have at least 4/32 of tread depth in it. Then I'm going to check my rim, make sure it's properly mounted, secured, and that crack, bent, or broken, no illegal welds. Then I'm going to check my lug nuts, make sure they're all present, make sure they're all tight. I'll check for a loose lug nut by seeing either a rust trail or shiny metal or oblong holes. I'll check my valve stem, make sure it's properly mounted, secured, it's not leaking, and it has a cap on it. As you can see, this one doesn't. Make sure it has a cap on it. And I'll make sure my tire is filled to the manufacturer's specification. Then I'll check my oil seal. If it doesn't have a glass, it has this plug in there. You pull that plug out, it should be filled right at the bottom of this. Yeah, you can say that. That's good too. You can, when you're checking your brake liners, just make sure they're not dangerously thin, less than 1/4 inch of brake lining.